Welcome to a new Smart Money video, and in today's video we're going to cover how to make a pros and cons list right. I say right because there are a few pitfalls that people get into, and if you do them, your whole exercise is sabotaged. So what are some of the common mistakes that people make? What are the little tweaks that you need to do to ensure that you do not fall prey to those same mistakes? We are going to cover that today. We're also going to look at an example on how to do this. If you like to get videos on personal growth, investing, and business, please consider subscribing to the channel. Alright, so let's get on to how do we do a pros and cons list. Step number one, you need to be very clear and very specific about the decision or choice that needs to be made. This is where some people go wrong. What they do is they say, I would like to study further. Let me write down the pros and cons. Well, actually, that's really difficult because if you would like to study further in order to enhance your career, that's one thing. But if you would like to study further because you want to become better at a certain hobby, well, that's another thing. And the pros and cons list will be totally different. And so one of the mistakes that people make is that they're too general in their decision or in the choices that they use. You see, what we want to do by being specific is that we want to get our mind into a system 2 way of thinking. Now, the system 2 way of thinking is where you are rational, where you're considering the different options, versus system 1, where it is really fast, sometimes emotional. It's that intuition and that instinctive response. You see, a pros and cons list is definitely not system 1. It is an effort and an attempt to disengage your system 1 thinking, that fast way of thinking, and put in place the sensible, logical, rational evaluation that you can do. And so by being specific on the topic, you start to engage that part of your brain. Step number 2 is to write down the pros and cons. So you have your topic, your decision, or your choices. Now you write down the pros, the benefits, the good things that would happen if you did this. And you write down the negatives, the cons, the bad things that would happen if you did it. You simply write them down. Now, what is the trick? What is the trick on how to get more pros and cons, to get an even bigger list? Frame up your question as a decision between alternatives. So instead of just saying, I would like to study business management, you say, I would like to study business management, or I would like to study calligraphy. Now that might sound strange because they're two totally different things. But what it does is that your brain is a difference engine. It likes to contrast. It likes to compare. And so by giving your brain options, it starts to generate even more possibilities of pros and cons. And this is really important because you do want as many as possible. Now, the pitfall that many people fall into when doing it, which invalidates their pros and cons list, is that they judge each item as they're writing it down. So in other words, I want to study calligraphy. Well, this is not going to make any money. Well, that's obvious, so I'm not going to put it on my list. No, you should put that on the list. Later on, we will go through a technique designed to work with your brain, with how we function as human beings, in order to help you to do better at which items to exclude and which items to include. For now, just write down as many things as possible into your pros and into your cons list. Now, step number 3. Once you have your list of pros and cons, you want to work through that list so that only the important things remain. And actually step 3, 4, and 5 are going to cover this. So step number 3, what people often do is that they put a weighting next to each item. So for example, they would say, hey, at the end of the day, if I study calligraphy, I'm going to have a lot of fun. And fun in my life is important, so I'm going to give that a 10. And it's not going to earn any money, so I'm going to give that a 1. So when you're adding up at the end, you would have 11. 10 for having fun, 1 for not making money. And that gives you an overall pro score of 11. Now, I want to tell you the flaw in that. Our brains work in a way that they seek what is called confirmation. Now, confirmation bias is the problem. Confirmation bias means that if you really want to do what you're busy creating your pros and cons list about, you are going to subconsciously engineer it in that way so that you end up doing it. This is a really big problem. You see, the whole point of a pros and cons list is that you get out of this feeling, this want, this desire, and out of the problem of just trying to do something that you want to do and rather doing something which is beneficial. The pros and cons list is supposed to make it beneficial. So if you weight things, but while you're weighting it, you're subconsciously fulfilling your desire, you're in trouble. So how do we get around this? Well, I would say, don't do a weighting as in 1 to 10, rating the very best things to the worst things, because that does set itself up for confirmation bias. Rather, just go through your list. If you notice anything which you would consider really, really silly or fluff, remove that. Something which is really not a benefit, not a con. You just wrote it down in your brainstorming session. Now's the time to remove it. Steps 4 and 5 are going to explain what you do with the rest of them, and we will get to those in a moment. If you're enjoying this video, please smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Now, steps 4 and 5, hardly anyone does these, but they're actually critical to the success of a pros and cons list. What is step number 4? It is to go through your pros and to see if you can fault them. Yes, fault them. In other words, are you being overly optimistic? Are you blowing things out of proportion? If I study business management, I'm going to become the CEO of a company within a year. That is amazing benefit, a wonderful pro of study. But is that realistic? Is that over optimistic? Perhaps you need to readjust that one, or you need to remove it entirely. And so go through each and every one of your pros now and say, is this too optimistic? Is this unrealistic? And if it's too optimistic, change it so that it's correct. And if it's unrealistic, well, remove it from your list. You see, what we're doing now is we're moving into the critical or the judgmental part of our brain. Before, we operated in the creative space. We wrote a list. We wrote down anything and everything. We're being creative. And that's good, and it activates certain part of our brain. Now, you can't be creative and judgmental at the same time, but now that we've finished being creative, let's be judgmental. Let's go through the list and remove the things which are unrealistic. Another good way to tell if something is unrealistic is, would you be embarrassed to share this benefit or this pro with your friends or your family, your pastor, someone in authority? Because if you are embarrassed, it probably means it is unrealistic. It means it's a little bit dreamy, a little bit cloudy fluff. And that is something you should look to remove from your pros list. So either you rewrite it to be grounded and sensible, or you remove it. Now, what is step number 5? And this is really important. As you guessed, it has to do with working on the cons side of the list. And step number 5 is not just about removing unrealistic cons or bad things that could happen, but actually step number 5 is about asking, can I mitigate and therefore remove any of these cons? What do we mean by mitigate? Well, if we say, I don't have the money right now to study. Well, is that a con or a constraint? Because remember, we're writing a list of cons, not of constraints. And so it's a constraint, so therefore I can mitigate and move it out of the cons list. As a constraint, I can develop a plan in order to solve it. And so therefore that's one way we can mitigate a con. Another con might be that I will spend less time with my family because I am studying. Well, a way to mitigate that con is, well, let me watch less TV and therefore have more time for my family. So, okay, this is actually not a problem. I can remove it. Something to watch out for. If you are going to stop something, or the decision has to do with moving away from something that you have been doing, your brain naturally has this thing called the sunken cost fallacy operating. And what it means is that wherever you've put time and effort into something, your brain has a very hard time letting go. It doesn't want to let go because the thinking is, I've put so much time and so much effort into this. If I walked away now, I would lose all that time and all that effort. And it's true, you would lose it. But at the end of the day, you have to watch out. Are you making the decision based on facts, logic, and what's best for your future in line with your goals? Or are you falling prey to the sunk cost? If you are falling prey to sunk costs, be sure to remove those cons because they should not be there. Now, to finish off the pros and cons list exercise, it's very simple. You simply add up your pros and you add up your cons, and if you have more pros than cons, well, it's probably going to be a good idea. Some people recommend having at least 1.5 times to 2 times as many pros to cons. I would say read through it rather and look at it and say, does the pros move me closer to my goals, and can I live with the cons? Because if you can, that's probably a decision that you should go with. I hope that you have enjoyed today's video. Please remember to like and subscribe to the channel, as well as share this video with someone else, because together we can create an abundance.